We spent quite a bit of time looking at the movement called Impressionism. I defined it as, in many ways, the last phase of realism in the context of the 19th century. By the end of the 19th century, Impressionism will still not be acceptable as a formal approach to painting to many in the art world. But it was in turn being rejected as an approach by a new generation of young artists who were dissatisfied to some extent with the subject matter of some Impressionist painting, which did not seem to have much meaning to it. But mostly it was being rejected because it was perceived as a rather amorphous, transient style that really did not satisfy a new generation of artists who were perhaps not as interested in breaking form down into component elements such as light and color. Impressionism, one can say, based upon looking at Claude Monet's famous work, Impression Sunrise, had dematerialized the visual world to the point where artists felt a desire to move toward recomposing the visual world, to reconstructing and making it more significant in its meaning. Now, the fact is that Impressionism could not be denied in terms of the traditions that it had left for this new generation of artists. For one thing, the Impressionists had clearly established greater freedom of brushstroke as something which was appropriate, even for great painting, even for painting in the salon. They had introduced a new palette, not a palette based on the old masters, browns and grays and blacks, but in fact, a palette that emphasizes brightness and lightness and white in particular. And in fact, those two aspects of Impressionism are going to be pursued by a new generation of painters whom we throw into this sort of catch-all and call post-Impressionists. I say it's a catch-all because Impressionism was actually the name of a movement. You remember it was given by a critic based on visiting the Impressionist exhibition in 1874. But post-Impressionism was never a formal movement. These artists didn't formally show together. In fact, many of them started out as Impressionists or influenced by Impressionism, and then they moved in a different direction. The four major post-Impressionists whom we're going to look at are Georges Seurat, Georges, last name Seurat, S-E-U-R-A-T, Paul Cézanne, P-A-U-L, last name C-E-Z-A-N-N-E, accent aigu over the E, the first E, Vincent van Gogh, V-A-N, new word, G-O-G-H, and finally, Paul Gauguin, capital G-A-U-G-U-I-N, Gauguin. It's literally through the works of those four post-Impressionists that we are going to see modern art in the 20th century develop. Without any one of these artists, it certainly would not have been the same at the beginning of the 20th century. So let's see what they contributed. Georges Seurat studied at the École des Beaux-Arts, and he attended atelier classes with a pupil of Ingres. So we're still dragging some of these same artists and these same traditions along into the late 19th century. Seurat greatly admired the work of Ingres, whom he studied by making copies from his work in the tradition of the Academy. But he also greatly admired, in a seemingly contradictory way, the work of Eugène Delacroix. And of course, Delacroix and Ingres have traditionally been set up as opposites in the context of the 19th century, particularly in terms of style. Seurat was particularly fascinated by color. So he was drawn to Delacroix. What he saw in Delacroix's paintings was a kind of celebration of color that he also wanted to instill into his own works. He noted how Delacroix used complementary colors, that is, colors which are opposite each other on the color wheel, therefore contain nothing of each other, and therefore will tend to fight each other for dominance. So a violet and a yellow, an orange and a blue, for instance, green and red, those colors are called complementary colors, and they will fight for dominance and create a very activated surface. Also, based on his studies of 19th century color theorists such as Eugène Chevreul, whom I mentioned when we talked about the Impressionist, Chevreul, Eugène Chevreul, whose theories had influenced the Impressionist painters, Seurat believed that color, in fact, could be controlled. It could be manipulated if you understood it well enough according to confirmable laws. Among the laws and the theories that he would, in essence, set out to prove in terms of color was one propounded by Chevreul, which was called simultaneous contrast of colors. And I show you a chart which is traditionally used to help you understand what is meant by simultaneous contrast of colors. It's a visual phenomenon. It's really quite fascinating in terms of how our eyes perceive color. So these sort of muddy-colored greenish discs that you see in the center of each of the squares, which are in turn made up of triangles, yes? Each of these discs is interesting in terms of the way we perceive how light or dark they are. Do you see that? Some of them look very dark. Some of them look very light. And in fact, the discs are all exactly the same shade, the same color. Any perceptible change that you perceive must be accounted for by the hue, value, or intensity of the color on which they sit. In other words, on the surrounding color. So what this is telling Seurat is it's very important if you want to control perception in painting that you are careful about what colors you put together, what color you put on top of another color. So this is a visual phenomenon called simultaneous contrast of colors. The fact that the discs look more intense and brighter against a darker color is something that is quite amazing. Obviously, one of the basic tenets of this phenomenon of simultaneous contrast is the fact that two colors could possibly influence each other this much, so that we view them, we look at them and see them very differently. But in fact, Seurat noted this. He was fascinated by this because it seemed to be a way to control how we, all of us, perceived his paintings and perceived color. He started an intensive kind of investigation of Delacroix's paintings, going to the Louvre to study them, to look closely at them. And he soon discovered, especially in Delacroix, that the observation of color principles, which he was seeing in, for instance, the context of simultaneous contrast, which was something not known to Delacroix, that in fact Delacroix was doing things mostly intuitively. Okay, so this was unknown to Delacroix. Delacroix was doing things by observation rather than, in other words, instinctually rather than by following rules. In any case, by what he was learning from Delacroix, from that intuitive point of view, and applying now all of these color theories, he was hoping to apply all of this knowledge of color methodically and perhaps be able to reconcile the rigid principles about line versus color that we know is something that had controlled the history of painting in Western Europe for such a long period of time. He wanted to reconcile art and science. In 1883, all of his Salon entries, except a portrait drawing, were rejected by the Salon. His first major composition was also rejected by the Salon in 1884, and that is the painting which I show you here. It's called Une Baignade, or translated, Bathing at Asnières. Extremely discouraged by the fact that there seemed to be a pattern in terms of his works being rejected by the Salon, Seurat and a number of other younger generation artists decided to participate in the founding of a new artist exhibition. They founded the Société des Indépendants, the Salon of the Independent Artists. And this is 1884. They stated that their organization stood for the suppression of juries and proposed to help artists to freely present their work before the bar of public opinion. This is a very important point, again, in terms of the history of painting and in terms of artists having greater freedom to exhibit their work in the context of the 19th century. This is going to increase the number of venues for artists, and increasingly, as we see these things happening, these independent exhibitions, it's eventually going to break the back of the Academy and, of course, the Salon as the sole place where one could make one's reputation. So what we have here is a painting which shows leisure time. This is something that follows on what the Impressionist painters, artists like Renoir, for instance, and even Monet had painted. Leisure time in which you can lie out by the river and swim a bit or do some boating, as you can see in the background. There is in this work by Seurat not only then the subject matter of the Impressionists, but there's a very light palette. And the palette relates to Impressionism. But Seurat is not interested in that greater freedom of brushstroking. Even though you see the way the water is broken up and seems to reflect on Monet's approach, for instance, to painting water, his approach to applying the paint is much tighter. It's not academic classicism, that's for sure. There's a very different look to it. But Seurat increasingly was going to leave nothing to chance or improvisation. He evolved a technique of working with 4 basic colors and their intermediaries. So in other words, he wanted to be able to control color, to use basic colors, primary colors in some cases, and variations on those colors. So he chose blue, red, yellow, and green. Green is not a primary. It can be mixed, but that's the color that he chose. He would mix these colors with white, and to assure a greater luminosity, a greater clarity of the color, he did not typically mix the colors themselves, those four colors among themselves. The principle of optical mixture had been practiced by the Impressionists, but again, their execution in terms of applying color had been in these short, choppy brushstrokes. I defy you to find anything particularly short or choppy in this work by Seurat. And that's because he started actually using small brushstrokes, sort of little hatch-sized brushstrokes, one right next to the other. And he really did want your eye to begin to fuse them, but they're not as large in a sense, and I hate to use a pejorative word, but not as sloppy, perhaps, as an Impressionist work such as the work of Monet might look. And then, as he began to experiment, he thought he needed more mathematical strictness. He needed to, if he was going to apply a certain amount of color, he needed to know exactly how much, because it would affect how much influence there would be on a color nearby. So he began to apply paint in small dots. These small dots, according to Seurat, would in fact create a greater intensity and luminosity of color and lead to better control of color. Each of his canvases was like a scientific experiment in color. Even his sketches were these experiments of using very small hatch marks or very small dots of color. These are some studies for the Sunday afternoon on the island of the Grand Jatte. A painting which he started making studies for in 1884, the same year as the La Bagnade. He decided he wanted to create a large-scale painting of crowds of people in a public park on the island of La Grande Jatte, Grande, capital Jatte, which was near Asnières, near the site of his painting La Bagnade. In fact, it's been pointed out by one art historian that this early painting is seemingly on one side of the river, and that the Sunday afternoon on the island of the Grand Jatte looks as though they're looking over to the other side because they're facing in a different direction. You're going to see it in just a moment. It's kind of interesting how they come together as a kind of diptych in that way. He painted the landscape first, doing a whole series of studies, and then he began observing people on Sunday afternoon, the middle classes who frequented the park. He also had models and come to his studio, models who were dressed up and pose for him. We know that he actually did observe a woman walking along the bank of the river, and this is the Seine River, S-E-I-N-E, the same river we've been talking about that flows through Paris. He actually saw a woman walking her monkey on a leash. And so you can see he made a sketch of it here on the right-hand side. This is the Sunday afternoon on the island of the Grand Jatte, completed in 1885. It is today in the Art Institute in Chicago. And very unfortunately, it's behind glass. And I understand why. They have to protect it. But it makes it really hard to see or to look at very readily. It's 7 feet tall by 10 feet wide. Now this is an image from a different slide, and you can see it's much brighter than what we were looking at. It's still, the color is still not perfect, but it's a pretty good image to begin to talk about the composition. What we're seeing here is a kind of rigidity in every aspect of the work. from the rigidity of vertical and horizontal lines that dominate literally every aspect of this composition, to the rigidity in the application of paint. The subject matter was certainly one that the Impressionists had been examining, and that is again the middle classes who have this time off, particularly on Sunday when one can have a kind of leisure day. You can picnic, you can walk, you can get together with friends. The animals can go out and run around, and so that's what he's trying to show us. Sunday afternoon on the island of the Grand Jatte. There is a wonderful description of the painting that's from 1885, and I'd like to read it to you. It says, "Under a blazing mid-afternoon summer sky, we see the Seine River flooded with sunshine, smart townhouses on the opposite bank, and small steamboats, sailboats, and a skiff move up and down the river. Under the trees closer to us, many people are strolling. Others are sitting or stretched out lazily on the bluish grass. A few are fishing. There are young ladies, a nursemaid, a Dantesque old grandmother under a parasol, a sprawled-out boatman smoking his pipe, the lower part of his trousers completely devoured by the implacable sunlight. A dark-colored dog of no particular breed is sniffing around. A rust-colored butterfly hovers in midair. A young mother is strolling with her little girl, dressed in white with a salmon-colored sash. 2 army officers from Saint-Cyr are walking by the water. Of the young ladies, one of them is making a bouquet. Another is a girl with red hair in a blue dress. There's a married couple carrying a baby. And at the extreme right appears a scandalously hieratic-looking couple, a young dandy with a rather excessively elegant lady on his arm who has a yellow, purple, and ultramarine monkey on a leash." So that's I think, a very good definition that causes our eyes to kind of move around to see who the major protagonists are in the painting. But again, I think we don't so much look at one or the other of the figures. Even the female figure here that's sort of center in terms of focus is not one figure that keeps us looking and continuing to be interested. We tend to move all around the painting. And what strikes us, as I said before, is the excessive orderliness of everything. It's a very different painting from Impressionism. Very different. There's more of a sense of solidity of forms. The forms have been sort of geometricized. I mean, that's something I'm going to talk about when we look at Cézanne. But I think you'll agree with me, they have been compacted a bit more. And we don't see that kind of brush stroking that we're so used to in the Impressionist painting. I think, in fact, whereas an Impressionist is trying to capture a moment in time, that Seurat was actually hoping to capture the essential quality of time. And it doesn't have to be that singular moment, even though I must say, it looks like everything has been frozen into one moment in time. He wants to pull together the disintegrating forms of Impressionism into a different kind of painting, using a different style, a different approach to the application of paint. And the technique of painting that he used was one invented by Seurat and has come to be known as pointillism. 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 Point in French means period or dot. Seurat called his style divisionism. Divisionism, just like it sounds, divisionism. And basically what he's talking about is a technique of applying paint in dots of color placed side by side in what Seurat believed was a very controlled scientific manner. Each color dot calculated to have an effect on its neighbor. And while he worked, Seurat always concentrated on a single section of the canvas, determining prior to working on that section of the canvas exactly perhaps how many dots, what colors exactly are going to be used. He rarely, we are told, stepped back from the canvas. This sounds like our man Turner, by the way, who was a bit sloppier with his application of paint, but Seurat one could never call sloppy. The work was shown in the 8th and last Impressionist exhibition in 1886. But actually, La Grande Jatte, the Sunday afternoon on the island of Grande Jatte, is not the most, I don't want to use so many pejoratives here, it's not the most doctrinaire, the most stiff, the most unyielding approach in terms of his divisionist works. He, in fact, and we see this even in later paintings, such as this seascape, the port of Gravelines Channel, is he would often fill the back area, the background, with small strokes of color. Because you know, if you put 2 circles side by side, or 4 circles, you're going to leave, there's going to be some space, right? They're not going to fill the way little squares would completely fill in. And so he would actually fill in the canvas and as a kind of underpainting for the dots that then went on top. He didn't want any white or underpainting to show through. Within 2 years, Seurat began executing a series of landscapes and seascapes that were based on this orderly, scientific approach to applying color to a canvas. The critic Félix Fénéon wrote in 1886, "The period of hesitation is over. From picture to picture, these painters have consolidated their style, increased their observations, and clarified their science." Whoops, I want to leave that one up. Sorry. This particular seascape was painted just 1 year before Seurat's death at the premature age of 31 in 1891. The small dots are clearly the dominant element, the dominant structural basis upon which the entire painting is created. Keep in mind that he was also very aware that warm colors tended to come forward to the front of the picture plane, while cool colors tended to appear to recede. So this was another approach that, of course, has been intuitively known by painters for many generations, but he's trying to use that as well to build a sense of dimensionality within his painting. During his lifetime, Seurat's art was denigrated. In fact, one critic called his art reality reduced to confetti. Camille Pissarro, one of the great Impressionist painters of the era, admired Seurat's painting and believed that a more scientific application of color could be advantageous, could be interesting for artists to experiment with. And he began calling Seurat and a group of artists who tried to paint this way scientific impressionists, which I think is one way of aligning them, certainly with the Impressionist movement. Any questions? Because of the importance of Paul Cézanne's innovations in painting and the importance of their impact on the art of the 20th century, He has been called the father of modern painting. Now, again, one could argue in terms of history, and history instructors will tell you that the modern period is said to begin with the Renaissance and come all the way forward. So what's interesting about that is that with Cézanne, we're talking about an artist whose work defines the modern period. The kind of work, the kind of painting that is so different, such a different paradigm, such a different shift from what had been done before, that in terms of revolutionary vision, Cézanne is often compared to Giotto de Bondone. Now, if you had the History of Art 1B, you may remember Giotto, G-I-O-T-T-O, G-I-O-T-T-O. Giotto is often called the father of Renaissance painting. Because he, like Cézanne, created literally a new vision. He rejected the vision of the Middle Ages, the two-dimensional, flat, otherworldly representations for a more realistic world. One might say then that Cézanne is moving us in another direction. In essence, one might say rejecting some of the Renaissance ideals that ultimately were established by Giotto. One of the things, for instance, that he's not particularly concerned about is Renaissance perspective. He creates his own perspective space, and we can make our way through it, but it's a very different kind of perspective, as we will see. Cézanne was born in the south of France, in the city called Aix-en-Provence, AIX-EN-Provence, Provence. He was studying to become a lawyer when he fell in love with painting. He went to Paris in 1861 and studied art at a private atelier.
What year was it?
1861. He applied for entrance to the École des Beaux-Arts, but he was rejected. And I do want to remind you that in the video that we saw of the Impressionists, he was that very strange-looking dark figure you sometimes see sitting at the table. They did mention who he was, but he sort of was hanging around with the Impressionists. His earliest tendencies, as we can see from a photograph on the left-hand side and a self-portrait from 1861, is to simplify. In fact, one could say it looks like he learned a lot from Manet, because you do not get, again, that kind of value gradation, the modeling of form three-dimensionally, the careful observation of the light source as it defines the figure in this case. So we're looking here at his own self-portrait based on this photograph, and we see again, as I said, this desire to simplify and to even flatten. He became close friends of the Impressionists, as I mentioned, and as we saw in that video that we looked at last week, particularly close to Pissarro, and he greatly admired academic painters as well, and he also knew Courbet. So this is someone who got around, who had met and ultimately would be influenced by a number of different sources. He first exhibited his painting at the Salon des Refusés in 1863. Well, why not? Everybody else got their crap in. I shouldn't say it that way. Everyone else got the rejected works shown at the Salon des Refusés, those works that had been rejected by the official salon. Unfortunately for us, in terms of following the critical discussion of his work, there is no critical discussion of his work. It's as though he's basically ignored in this early period. Subsequently, his paintings were rejected at the salons of 1864, 66, 67, 68, 69, 76, 78, 79, 80, 81, 83, 84, 85, 86, 87, 88. Did you get all that down? Do you understand what's happening with this man and his art? Yeah. Even Manet did not have that kind of rejection. Remarkable because, like Manet, who came from a good family, Cézanne's ambition was to have his work accepted and shown in the official salon, to make a reputation, to sell his works through the salon, to be awarded the Legion of Honor. And you remember in the video how we saw Manet receive the Legion of Honor at the very end of his life. He wanted to be recognized as a serious painter, as a fine painter. This is a work called Man in a Blue Cap, also Uncle Dominic, by Cézanne. This is about 1865-66. It's another important early work to look at because we start to see some of his tendencies. And his tendency, of course, is to flatten, but it's to use broad areas of color, much broader in most cases than we've seen any Impressionist painter use. In an Impressionist painting, we tend to get more of those flickering brush strokes. He is using a palette knife here to apply the paint. And he's exaggerating the contours and exaggerating the planes of color across that sort of off-white coat, the tie, and even his hat. We're beginning to see a technique evolving of modeling in sequences of graded areas of color. And again, going beyond what we've seen in Cézanne, sort of ignoring the intervals of value, and simply moving to place large areas of color onto the canvas. Bright color was never a factor in Cézanne's work. We've seen already two works where he seems to be basically quite conservative. It is the influence of the Impressionist palette that's going to be very important for Cézanne's palette. But once he settles on his palette, he doesn't change. And again, is not particularly interested in bright color. Manet would ultimately refuse to exhibit in the first Impressionist exhibition, I want to remind you. Not only because he thought that his work would be seen by more people at the Salon, but because he didn't want to show his work alongside Cézanne. As I remind you, Cézanne showed in the first Impressionist exhibition. This work, Modern Olympia, was exhibited in that exhibition along with two landscapes. 1872-73. It was meant to be sort of a salute to Manet, right? To Manet's Olympia, perhaps a very different kind of painting, in which we see the suitor actually present. So in Manet's work, you remember, we were the viewer or the suitor. We were standing there looking at her as she reclined. We saw the servant behind the bed with the flowers. We saw the cat. Well, now look, we've got a little dog. We've got the suitor actually here. We have the servant behind, and we have the woman sort of in a kind of fetal position in her bed. Criticism of this work went beyond perhaps anything we've heard previously, even from Manet. It was vitriolic. One critic saying, "Do you remember the Olympia of Monsieur Manet? Well, that was a masterpiece of drawing accuracy and finish compared to Monsieur Cézanne. This is an artist who's still very young, who is still experimenting, who is trying to find his style. By 1873, in the House of the Hanged Man, we start to see that style coming together. This is one of the landscapes that was also shown in the First Impressionist exhibition. And it's considered a kind of standard example of Cézanne's Impressionist period style. What we see right away is the freshness, the openness, the sense of countryside, the wholesomeness of the work, which is very different from the earlier works that I was showing you. And certainly the palette has been brightened tremendously. The Impressionists brought that brighter palette to Cézanne and also taught him to apply the paint a bit more sensitively. I want to go back here to this work, the Modern Olympia. That's not sensitive application of paint. This is more, it's more impressionist, it's more sensitive in terms of small strokes. Throughout the 1870s, despite repeated rejection of his work at the Salon, Cézanne continued to associate with the Impressionists, exhibiting still lifes and landscapes in the Third Impressionist exhibition in 1877. But between 1877 and 1895, he showed very little. And he was very little known to what one might call the avant-garde, to other painters. Only 2 works were exhibited in Paris between 1877 and 1895, and these were 2 landscapes that actually were admitted, one of the few times his work was admitted to the Salon in 1882. I want to show you what he was doing by 1882. This is called the Small Bridge, or the Bridge at Mancy. This is a relatively modest painting in size. And what we are aware of, as we were with even his earliest paintings, is his tendency to simplify and to geometricize the world around him. He is rebuilding forms in space, and although one could say that the Small Bridge is a kind of landscape which is dependent upon a knowledge of Impressionism, it is not an Impressionist landscape, because he's building the forms up. He's building the atmosphere up. He's not, in a sense, dissolving it away. Do you see the difference in terms of Monet's painting of the Seine River at Giverny, where literally it looks as though forms are devoured by light, that light is very carefully observed in Monet's painting. Whereas I would point out in Cézanne, I have it back up here again, Cézanne was not interested in capturing transient moments and times, and he wasn't particularly interested in being sure that you understood where the light was coming from. For Cézanne, light is used in a kind of universal way. Can you tell where the light is coming from in this painting? You should answer no. No, you can't. But you can, if I back up, you can in the Monet here on the right-hand side. So this is a very different approach. He's not interested in that, capturing that moment in time. In his paintings, in his world, there is no time of day. His forms exist in a kind of universal light that he chooses to manipulate as he wills it. One of Cézanne's most famous pronouncements was, quote, "I want to make of Impressionism something solid and durable, like the art of the museums." He thought, in a sense, that he was going to rescue painting. So let me repeat that. I want to make of Impressionism something solid and durable, like the art of the museums. By the way, on our third test, I'm going to be giving you quotes by artists and showing you works of art, and you'll have to identify the artist. So you need to start taking down the quotes. Cézanne said, "I want to make of Impressionism something solid and durable, like the art of the museums." And in fact, in The Small Bridge, or The Bridge at Mancy, we begin to understand his other statement, I don't want to reproduce nature. I want to recreate it. That's very different from the Impressionists. I don't want to reproduce nature. I want to recreate it. What does he mean by that? He means that as the artist, it is his prerogative to recreate, to emphasize certain things and de-emphasize certain things if he wills, to use planes and volumes and lines, and to depart from the actual reality to create a different kind of reality, to recreate nature, not to reproduce it. He was an artist who literally would want to capture the essence of the work, but not like an impressionist. He would capture both the two-dimensional patterns and the three-dimensional world that he was looking at, and he could integrate both of those into the space of the painting. The work that you're looking at has a wonderful example of that, in the sense that he really is inviting us in to a landscape. What is this down here, by the way?
Water.
What is it?
Water.
Water. Is it the usual color of water? Not really. It's been changed. But how did you recognize it as water? Reflections. Okay, there are reflections. And it would seem that what we have here is a pathway, a stone angled bridge to a wooden bridge down over to another side, over a stream of water. And it looks as though we're getting the bank or the edge of the stream here, and that, I don't know about you, I kind of lose it here because I'm wondering what this is. And the best I can come up with is it's a reflection of this bit of wall or support of the bridge, but it's not exactly what I would have expected here. And that's because Cézanne chose to manipulate the space, the color, the shape, for whatever effect he wanted within the painting. The same is true on the left-hand side of the painting, where we're looking at really a predominant sort of oval shape with a line through it. Do you see how flat all of this is? So what is this over here? What is this in reality? What is this? Just tell me again.
Water.
Water. This is water. And again, how do we know? Well, this is a reflection. But does that look like the way we understand reflections in reality? No. Does Cézanne care? No. He says, I can change. I can recreate what I'm looking at. And what he's done here is emphasize the two-dimensional flat surface of the canvas, while simultaneously we are reading a three-dimensional work that moves our eye back into the distance. Look at the background here. he's going to force us to begin to read what's going on, and we are going to read it as a forest, and then all of the leaves and the branches, but they have been reduced down to the most severe kinds of geometric elements that again emphasize the two-dimensional flat surface of the canvas. Do you understand what he's done here? In the Renaissance, they invented one-point linear perspective so that they could falsify to our eyes the fact that, yeah, this looks like a flat surface, but if I use perspective, it's going to look like a window on reality. I'm going to be able to go through and see everything in scale and realistically. But Cezanne is rejecting Renaissance perspective. Now, I know you're saying to yourself, he just didn't know how to paint. But actually he did. He did know how to paint. Increasingly, we're going to see artists who will reject the status quo. I mean, we've seen this all along in small increments, certainly, but increasingly we are going to see that as important. In November of 1895, after having moved back home to Aix-en-Provence, Cezanne had a major show of his works at a dealer in Paris named Ambroise Vollard, who, by the way, would be the dealer of Pablo Picasso, Vollard. It was Cezanne's first one-man show, a retrospective, 150 paintings. It resulted in many sales and a great deal of critical discussion, which elevated him as a major artist in this period at the very end of the 19th century. This is one of my favorite Cezannes because he's literally defying you in terms of what is represented here. This is called Still Life with Plaster Cupid. Increasingly, he is flattening out the idea of the Renaissance window on reality. So let me just ask you something for practical matters. What is this right here, this large area? What is this? So intellectually, you have to read it as it's the floor. Yeah. This is the floor. All right? You with me? This is the floor. It can't really be anything else. It's the floor. So what we have here is the foreground, the middle ground, and the background are becoming more and more one space, one area. Again, a rejection of traditional Renaissance perspective. Instead of emphasizing a recession in space, Cezanne draws each plane of color and each shape forward, compressing space and increasing the sense of our simultaneously looking at this work as a two-dimensional composition and organization of shapes and colors, while simultaneously we can still intellectually read it as a three-dimensional window on reality. There is incredible tension created by the objects and the juxtaposition of objects within the work here. Objects that we still realize as being objects of reality are also taking on new realities for us. There is seemingly arbitrary flattening and relationships within the painting. So, for instance, let's look at this sort of orange rectangle here. What is this right here? Intellectualize again. If this is the floor, what is this? Well, what would you put things on? A table. So this is a tabletop. And he allows us to see this as a separate element from the floor. It's a different color. And you see he puts a line in here. But you'll notice that sometimes He doesn't continue the line. So he's creating these ambiguities of where's the tabletop, where's the floor. He does it here again, where the floor color seems to come into the tabletop. We sort of lose it. And then we completely seem to lose it over here. Although with our eyes, we're going to continue it anyway, because he sort of started that line off for us. So we have a tabletop that functions as a tabletop, but also as a two-dimensional flat area of kind of a tangerine color. And on the tabletop, you have what you found often in Cézanne's studio, because he was obsessed with still life painting. And very often he'd have rotten fruit, because he would be working on a still life forever. The fruit would begin to rot, the onions would begin to sprout. But he'd continue to work on it. So we can see here some of the fruit that's part of his delight in still life on this tabletop, along with one of his favorite little statues, which, by the way, you can still see today in his studio in Aix-en-Provence. I've been lucky enough to visit there, and it was quite extraordinary. And they still have some of his, much of his equipment there, some of his clothing there. It's very strange in a way to be there, very wonderful. But you do see this. I'm going to show you a photograph taken, I believe, by the end of the 19th century in his studio that's going to show you this plaster Cupid. So this is a kind of Cupid figure, a nude classical figure that a still life painter would want to have in his studio to use as a prop. So that's fine. It's part of the painting, and it gives the painting a strong dynamic verticality. And then you notice the fruits around it. And then notice, please, that there's a little bit of drapery here on the table as well. And then the next thing we do is, if we follow this drapery, we suddenly realize that this drapery has become part of a painting that is sitting up against the wall in his studio. So that what was a reality here for us on the table suddenly is a painting. So you get a different reality here. And even the way that he paints the Cupid with this canvas as it leans against the wall, we're assuming, almost makes this look as though it's a separate painting against the wall. And in fact, he's playing with us even more, because here's another prop, a small sculpture, which is painted, and it's on a canvas. And we intellectually understand that it's at the back of the studio, right? Because it has to be on the floor at the back, leaning against the wall. What is this? What is this? Could be a pear or an apple. It's a piece of fruit. Where is it?
In the background.
On the floor. In the back, on the floor. But how can that be if it's the same size and the same color as the fruit that's on the table in the foreground? Right. We start to go, I don't know. It makes, in a way, it makes no sense. The subject of this painting is complex. You have the cast and the painted cast. You have the apples and the painted apples. You have the cloth and the painted cloth. And yet it's all an illusion. It's all painted. Cézanne distorts at will, but always for the sake of the composition. He is proclaiming the painter's right to recreate nature, to ignore the laws of representation formulated by artists since Giotto, since the Renaissance, to express what he felt was the essence of his subject as he saw it. You remember, he said he wanted to recreate nature. He favored a very constructive use of line in defining his forms and space. And remember, we've talked about line has been an issue for almost every artist that we've talked about. The interesting thing about Cézanne, he said that lines do exist in paintings or pictures, even if you don't see the kind of specific expressive line that's taught in the academy. Because if you simply apply a bit of color and you move it horizontally or you move it vertically, you're creating a line. So the line is there. The much debated opposition of drawing and color as a controversy was irrelevant to Cézanne. Line may not be a continuous kind of line between 2 points. It can be a contour, it can be a stroke of color or a color plane, but it's there as far as Cézanne is concerned, and he doesn't feel there should be any argument about whether there is line in painting. And there is his studio. After the spring break, I'll bring in some of my photographs. You are not allowed, don't tell anyone, you are not allowed to shoot photographs inside of the studio. So I did. Right. And I'll show you some. It will give you goosebumps. In 1902, Cézanne had a studio built to the north of Aix-en-Provence, overlooking the town. And from that spot above his studio, he had a view of a great mountain that still dominates the plains near Aix-en-Provence today. And it's called Mont Sainte-Victoire, the Mountain of Victory. Mont Sainte-Victoire is that sort of irregular triangle that you see as the focal point of this painting, beyond a vast plain of fields and trees and a few houses. He became obsessed with this mountain. He painted it over and over again. And when we look at them, we see a kind of natural transition toward greater abstraction. So this is 1887. This is 1890. Can you see the way he's used is what I call facets of color, sort of like a faceted stone, laying the color down flat and kind of pulling it across. We always recognize the landscape. We see the mountain, we see the fields, we see what we recognize, and yet it's becoming increasingly abstract. This is one of the last in a whole series of works that he did outside of his studio. You can see him there. Look at that. Hat, cravat, vest, overcoat, and he's painting en plein air. And this is a view from the late 19th century, a black and white photograph of Mont Sainte-Victoire. Boy, is that different. Aix-en-Provence has spread out all there, the city. And here it is in his painting of it. He has absolutely captured the essence of what he was looking at this time, at the end of the 19th and beginning of the 20th centuries. He creates a sense of three-dimensional space by establishing, to some extent, aerial perspective. That is, that things become less definite the farther away from us they are, and they become less distinct in terms of color. So aerial perspective is something that was known by painters going back into the whole history of painting, certainly back to the ancient Romans. And he uses those lighter colors then to allow our eye to move deeply into space, and the warmer colors to bring our eye forward. This is not Renaissance linear perspective, because I know as you look at this, you're tending to read it from down below and then you read it vertically up above. It's not traditional perspective. Cézanne said, color is perspective. In choosing colors from facet to facet, from place to place within the painting, he is making us aware of the properties of color, of the way that colors will advance and recede depending on how we read them. He eliminates details and creates an all-over patchwork of facets or planes of color that seem independent as abstract parts of the painting, but come together as a three-dimensional representation of the landscape. Although Cezanne is most famous for his still lifes and his portraits, his ambition in his late years was to create a monumental composition with nude figures. What is it? It's a demonstration piece. I mean, he was still linked in to the tradition of the demonstration piece. Beginning in the mid-1870s, he started a whole series of studies of single and numerous bathers grouped together. This is the so-called Great Bathers. It's also called the Philadelphia Bathers because it's in the Philadelphia Art Museum. That's my daughter, Gabi. Poor thing, I made her stand there so you could see. It's a very large painting, 6 feet 8 by 8 feet. It was his ambition to create a monumental work that included a setting and figures within that setting. This work is not finished. In fact, parts of the canvas show through, and that was, in fact, not his intention. But still, it gives us an idea of what he was attempting to do. It shows a roughly triangular composition, which, of course, is emphasized by the tree trunks that lean in toward the center of the canvas, as well as the female figures who are enclosed within the trees and who are grouped into compact groups within the work. There is a desire to create not only a foreground, but a more traditional middle ground and background. On the far side of this river, between the bathers and what may be a fisherman and perhaps his son here. Beyond that, we see sort of a little village in the far distance. This work tends to emphasize the fact that a certain amount of distortion in nature, especially if you're doing a still life or a landscape, can work and is acceptable. But our associations with proportion and the classical nude, the ideal nude, is so strong in terms of the Western European tradition, going back, of course, to the Greeks and carried on by Roman tradition, that we start to feel very uncomfortable looking at these nudes because they in no way come up to the traditional expectations that we have of the nude. Keep in mind that even Rodin, at about this period of time, had been subjected to a lot of criticism for his nudes because they also did not look like or have that sense of the classical ideal. The fact is the nudes are rather strange, awkward, one could even say grotesque. I mean, look at this. Does this work at all in terms of an understanding of the nude female body? No. It looks very artificial, very contrived. In fact, you wonder, did he ever study from the nude? Well, he did, certainly, because he attended classes, atelier classes, in Paris. But we also know he was very uncomfortable painting the nude, and that he rarely did so after his earliest experiences. So the fact is, to learn the nude, Cezanne looked at nudes of other painters. And so that clearly was to his detriment here, because he's inventing the nude or reinventing the nude, and he really creates something that is quite artificial, that doesn't have any of the sort of sensuality that one would like to have in a group of female nude bathers. So, is this a great painting? It is, and it isn't. But it is a landmark in terms of the history of modern art. Cezanne's work of the Great Bathers, despite all of the problems with the awkwardness and the lack of precise painting and the lack of proportion and the misunderstanding of movement of the human body, is important because he is, again, moving us toward looking at the two-dimensional surface of the painting. the brush strokes, the line, and the infinitely variable color, the warm and cool colors on the surface. Cézanne's Great Bathers stands at a crucial spot in Western European painting. It looks back to that older tradition of the demonstration piece. I remind you of Manet's teacher, Thomas Couture, the Romans of the Decadence, for instance. And it looks forward to compositions in modern art that in many ways are going to be based on what looks like extreme abstraction and a really movement away from the ideal. Because out of Cézanne's Great Bathers will come Matisse with a work called The Joie de Vivre, The Love of Life, and we have to see it as a predecessor of one of the great paintings of nudes in the early 20th century, Pablo Picasso's Demoiselles d'Avignon in 1907. Without Cézanne, there is no Cubism.